My name is Nora Whitman. I am 25, and I was adjusting the lace at the nape of my neck, my fingers trembling slightly despite the calm I projected as I caught my reflection in the copper backsplash behind the bar. It was a piece I had painstakingly restored over the past 3 months, sanding, polishing, and sealing it until it shone like a mirror. Only because of that meticulous work did I notice her, a shadow behind me, deliberate and silent. Vivian, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, stood just a few feet away. Her eyes were hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses, even indoors, a shield for her carefully curated persona. She didn't see my gaze in the reflective metal. She saw my champagne flute, poised on the counter like a target. I watched, frozen in that moment, as she slid a small glass vial from the satin folds of her clutch. 3 drops, crystal clear, fell into my drink. A shiver ran up my spine, but I didn't move. I didn't scream. I let her turn away, distracted by some politician's wife at the other end of the room. And then, with hands steady enough to suture a ruptured artery, I swapped the glasses. My champagne was safe. Hers now held the trap she intended for me. Most brides would have bolted to the nearest bathroom, hyperventilating, or at least made a scene. But I am Eleanor Nora Whitman, a restoration architect. I deal with structures on the brink of collapse for a living. Panic is a luxury I cannot afford, and fear a tool I never yield to. What I felt instead was static load. The term comes from engineering, describing the weight a beam bears quietly, silently, before it decides whether it will hold or snap. Right now, I carried a weight far heavier than any steel girder I had ever reinforced. I straightened my posture, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood as I returned to the head table. I checked my pulse, 80 beats per minute, elevated but under control. I sat beside Adrian, my husband, a pediatric neurosurgeon who saves lives daily, but was blissfully unaware that his own mother had become a silent predator. He leaned toward me under the table, brushing his thumb against my wedding band, and whispered that I looked breathtaking. His words nearly made me melt, but I couldn't allow them to. Not yet. Across the table, Vivian had assumed her position as queen of the room. The room hummed with the polite laughter of our elite guests, but her eyes were predators, cold and calculated beneath layers of mascara. She raised her glass, a silent toast, a checkmate in her mind, and smirked at me as if to say, "You have no idea what's coming." I picked up my water glass, the cold liquid sliding down my throat like clarity itself. My hand was steady. I watched her lift her chalice again, so confident, so sure that she would write my downfall in this golden liquid. Vivian had been orchestrating this for years, and I knew it. From the moment Adrian had introduced me to her, I had been a structural threat in her meticulously curated world. The Whitmans were old money, a lineage as brittle as their pride. She had always believed her wealth and legacy could intimidate anyone who dared disrupt it. I remember our first meeting at the Whitman estate, where I had arrived in dusty boots and a hard hat, a portfolio in my hands, and an eye for restoration projects. She looked at me as though I were an infection, a stain on the Whitman family fabric. "Oh," she had said, flat, when Adrian introduced me. Not hello, not welcome, just "oh," a subtle crack in the foundation she wanted me to notice. Over the next months, she launched her campaign quietly, surgically. Invitations to family gatherings omitted my name. She introduced me as Adrian's assistant to his peers. When she thought I wasn't looking, she'd whisper cutting remarks about my career and accomplishments. Small cracks in the floor, designed to make me stumble. Then, 6 months ago, she escalated. I found myself in her private library, the rich scent of leather and polish heavy in the air. A creamy envelope slid across the mahogany desk. Inside, a cashier's check for $100,000 gleamed against the paper. "You're sweet, Nora," she said, her voice syrupy with condescension. "But let's be realistic. You build things, we own things. You will never fit at this table. Take this. Consider it a courtesy. It was more money than my parents earned in 2 years. I slid it back across the desk. Vivian, I think you're underestimating the cost of labor. I'm not for sale. Her expression changed that day. Threat detected. My presence was no longer a nuisance. She considered me a liability that needed neutralizing. I had studied the behavior of narcissists alongside my work with structures. The psychology was similar: an extinction burst, a last desperate lunge of energy when control is slipping. And now, in this gilded ballroom, I was witnessing hers. The week before the wedding had been a full-force demonstration. She had tried to cancel florists, had inspected my veil until the lace tore. She had even sent cryptic emails to vendors, trying to create chaos. But I, a restorer, knew the material's strengths. I repaired the veil with gold thread, invisible to the naked eye, but stronger than before. And here we were, her final act, the poisoned champagne, intended to humiliate me, to prove to every guest that I did not belong. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the cool clarity contrasting with the chaos I anticipated. Vivian raised her glass high, the golden liquid catching the chandelier light, and smiled at the guests. Then her gaze locked with mine.
"Trust," she said with her eyes. "You will fail." I didn't blink. My water glass met hers in a silent countertoast. Time seemed to stretch. The applause for Adrian's speech faded. The room quieted. Vivian tipped the chalice back. 1 sip, 2 sips, she drained it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a slow-motion collapse, her knees buckled. She clutched the tablecloth, pulling a centerpiece of orchids to the floor, and the reaction began. It was violent, a chemical reaction perfectly executed, and yet she had forgotten one key detail. She had misjudged me. I remained seated, calm, observing every reaction. Chaos erupted around me. Guests screamed, cameras flashed. Adrian sprang into action, but I was the calm in the storm, the engineer of order in the collapse. I had spent years learning to read structures, to see stress points before failure. Now I read people the same way. Vivian's empire of control was cracking, and I was standing in the epicenter, steady, unyielding. And that, right there, was the moment the real wedding began. The Whitman estate had always been a fortress of appearances. Marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the kind of air that smelled faintly of old money and perfume meant to intimidate. It was within these walls that I first met Vivian, an encounter I would later understand as the blueprint for the war I never asked for. I had arrived that day in work boots and a hard hat, my hands streaked with drywall dust and polish from a restoration job that would later become the pièce de résistance of the Whitman ballroom. Vivian, draped in silk and diamonds, didn't shake my hand. She barely looked at me. Her eyes skimmed over my portfolio like it was an insect crawling across the polished wood of her library desk. "So, you build things," she said, her voice silky, measured. "And he trusts you?" I looked at Adrian, my calm anchor in a sea of judgment. He nodded, smiling, unaware of the storm that was about to descend. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. That day, I first noticed the subtle architecture of her cruelty. Small cracks in the floorboards of conversation, minuscule earthquakes of insult meant to destabilize. Over the next months, the attacks became a blueprint for her psychological demolition. She would invite Adrian and me to family dinners and omit me from key conversations. When she introduced me to friends, I was his project manager, never the accomplished architect with a master's degree and professional license. She left subtle reminders of my place in her world, whispered comments about the dirt on my boots, about how the furniture I designed for our home would never match the Whitman legacy. I took notes in my mind, the way I would take notes on a building's stress points. I cataloged every slight, every snide remark, because in my world, small cracks mattered, and in her world, control mattered above all else. Then came the envelope.
6 months before the wedding, I found myself alone in the Whitman library, the scent of polished mahogany filling my lungs. Vivian slid a creamy envelope across the desk, her perfectly manicured hand brushing mine as she did. "Consider this a courtesy," she said. Inside was a cashier's check for $100,000, more than my parents made in 2 years. She had meant it as a bribe, a way to buy me out, to remove the structural threat I posed to her empire of control. I looked at the check, I looked at her, and I said calmly, "I'm not for sale." Her eyes flickered then, something cold, something calculating. That was the moment I became a threat, not just a nuisance. And threats demanded neutralization. I had studied narcissists extensively alongside my work with materials and structures. There is a concept called the extinction burst, a sudden, desperate surge of energy when control is slipping. For a toddler, it's screaming, flailing, breaking. For someone like Vivian, it's meticulously orchestrated sabotage, the last desperate lunge before surrendering to reality. The week before my wedding was her extinction burst. She realized I wouldn't leave. Adrian wouldn't abandon me. So she went scorched earth. She tried to cancel our florist, claiming I died in a car accident. She tore my veil while inspecting it. She whispered to vendors, planted seeds of chaos, all in a bid to destabilize me. But she underestimated me. As a restoration architect, I understood tension, fragility, and the moments just before collapse. I repaired the veil with gold thread, invisible to the naked eye, but stronger than before. I fixed the broken floral arrangements myself, a subtle countermeasure to her invisible sabotage. She believed she could control every angle, every perception, every guest. She didn't account for the possibility that I could anticipate structural failure before it happened. I had studied her patterns, her methods. I knew she would escalate at the wedding, and I was ready. The night of the reception, as the chandeliers glimmered and the orchestra played softly in the background, I saw the culmination of her planning in one deliberate gesture. The vial, the poison, the attempt to humiliate me in front of everyone. Yet even in that moment, I was composed, calm, calculating, because I knew the principles of my work applied perfectly to this human drama. Understand the materials, anticipate the stress points, and act before collapse occurs. I took note of every micro-expression, every shift in weight, every hand movement. Vivian thought she was invisible. She wasn't. I was watching, waiting, and preparing. Every step she took toward me was like watching a beam bend under weight, the soundless warning before disaster. This was more than a wedding. It was a trial by fire, a test of structure, resilience, and foresight. And I was the architect of the countermeasure. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I didn't alert Adrian. Most people would have. Most people would have been swept away by the terror. But I had trained my mind for situations like this. For 2 years, Vivian had been building her demolition blueprint. For 2 years, I had been quietly studying her, waiting for the exact moment to intervene. The champagne glass swap was the culmination of months of silent preparation, a simple, elegant maneuver executed with surgical precision. Her plan had failed before it even began. The poison was now in her hand, and the real story, the story that would redefine the wedding, was only beginning. The reception hall shimmered under the light of crystal chandeliers, each beam bouncing off polished surfaces, gilded frames, and glassware that could have doubled as mirrors. Every table was meticulously set, every centerpiece perfect, except for the tension rippling through the air like a hidden earthquake. I felt it in my bones, a subtle vibration beneath the clinking of glasses and polite laughter. Vivian moved with a predator's grace, a rehearsed elegance that belied the venom in her intentions. She smiled at guests, complimented my parents on the decor, and raised her glass to mine, a silent toast, but one loaded with lethal purpose. I could see the calculation behind every step she took, the way her eyes flitted over me for signs of fear, the way her hand lingered on her clutch. I raised my water glass, deliberately slow, deliberate, the cool liquid grounding me. Vivian tilted her poisoned champagne, her perfect smile aimed at me, the deadly intent hidden beneath layers of mascara and silk. The room didn't notice, but I did. Time stretched. 1 second became 5, 5 became 10. I counted like a metronome, each heartbeat a measured strike against chaos. Most people would have panicked. I didn't. This wasn't fear, it was anticipation. I knew exactly how this moment would unfold. The principles of structural engineering, of tension and load, applied perfectly to human behavior. A body under stress, a mind under manipulation, both reveal cracks before they fail. And I had been studying Vivian for months. I knew her fractures, her predictable escalation. Adrian, oblivious to the danger, whispered something endearing in my ear. His thumb brushed mine, his warmth a tether to the world outside Vivian's web. I smiled softly, my gaze never leaving the matriarch. He had no idea the woman sitting so close to him intended to poison the woman he loved. Vivian raised her glass again, this time more deliberately. A friend of the family at table 4 chuckled at some joke she'd told, completely unaware of the venomous intent behind her practiced smile. She lifted the glass, paused, and then took a slow sip, 2, maybe 3 gulps. The orchestra's soft melody seemed to falter in my ears. I watched her throat work, her expression momentarily triumphant. The poison had entered her system. She thought the plan was flawless, a masterpiece of humiliation executed before an audience of hundreds. She didn't see the swap. She hadn't accounted for the architect who studied every stress point, every structural weakness, every moment of failure before it occurred. I adjusted my posture, keeping my hand steady, the water glass now a symbol of clarity amidst the storm. Guests were oblivious to the drama unfolding at the head table. They laughed, clinked glasses, and complimented the decor. No one could see the invisible battle being waged. Then the first sign, a slight tremor in her hand, subtle enough that no one else noticed, but enough to confirm the chemical reaction had begun. Her posture stiffened, her eyes flicked toward the crowd, and I knew the collapse had begun. The next 30 seconds were critical. A body under poison reacts with a signature rhythm, tension, then a brief illusion of composure, then failure. I observed every micro movement, the way her fingers curled around the glass, the slight blanching of her skin, the rapid, shallow inhale of breath. Adrian noticed the change before anyone else. "Vivian?" he asked, concern etching his voice. She smiled weakly, trying to maintain the facade. But the poison was doing its work. Her knees wobbled imperceptibly. Her hands grasped the table for stability. I rose, elegantly, my heels clicking against the hardwood like the measured beat of a metronome. Every step was precise, every motion calculated. Guests were still oblivious to the drama, lost in polite conversation, oblivious to the disaster looming. Then it happened. Vivian's knees buckled and she collided with the tablecloth, pulling down a centerpiece of white lilies in the process. The glass she had held toppled, shattering against the polished wood. The golden liquid, intended as a weapon, glimmered on the floor. The room froze, the music faltering. Guests' eyes widened, whispers began, and panic spread like wildfire. But I remained composed, the calm eye at the center of the storm. I directed the staff, guided Adrian, and cleared a path for the paramedics who had already been alerted. Every step, every instruction was precise, a testament to the principle that preparation and observation prevent disaster from becoming tragedy.
As she was stabilized and loaded onto a stretcher, her clutch fell to the floor. Lipstick, compact, and the small glass vial spilled across the polished hardwood. The evidence was literal, tangible, undeniable. I bent down, picking up a piece of cream-colored stationery that had fallen from the bag. In Vivian's own elegant script was a pre-written apology speech meant to frame me as unstable, to manipulate perception, to destroy my reputation. I handed it to Adrian, whose shock was visible, his eyes reflecting the realization of her premeditated cruelty. The architecture of her trap had been revealed in real time. The paramedics moved efficiently, but every second stretched like taffy. Vivian's body was tense, her breaths shallow, her eyes glassy with shock and chemical betrayal. The guests stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or wait for someone to take charge. I did neither. I simply observed, keeping my composure while calculating every next step. Adrian knelt beside her, his surgeon's instinct kicking in. "Vitals?" he demanded, his hands steady even as adrenaline surged through his veins. I handed him the vial and the cream-colored note. His eyes went wide as he scanned the contents. Evidence. Proof. The culmination of 2 years of harassment and manipulation. The police arrived minutes later, though I had already ensured they would be waiting, thanks to discreet messages to the venue manager, cameras strategically positioned during restoration work, and meticulous preparation for just such a contingency. Officer Cardona, a man whose face bore the permanent expression of someone who had seen family crises spiral out of control 100 times, took charge immediately. "Step back," he instructed, scanning the room, assessing the chaos. "Who's in charge here?" I raised a hand, calm, authoritative. "I am," I said, my voice steady over the murmurs. "I know exactly what happened. I have evidence." Adrian looked at me, his jaw tight, pride and relief mingling in his gaze. I handed him my phone, showing him the time-stamped footage of Vivian adding the poison to her own glass and then the switch I had executed. He watched in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a physical force. Then, finally, he turned to the officer. "This was premeditated," he said. "She intended to poison my wife, to humiliate her, and to control the narrative. There's a note, proof of her intentions." Officer Cardona nodded, taking the phone and note into evidence. "We'll handle it," he said, his tone clipped but respectful. "Right now, she needs medical attention." Vivian, still pale and trembling on the stretcher, glared at us with eyes that burned with a mix of rage and disbelief. She hadn't expected the architect to anticipate her moves, to predict every angle, every hidden vulnerability. She hadn't planned for foresight, for calculation, for strategy executed with precision. As the paramedics wheeled her out, the guests were left in stunned silence. Murmurs of shock, disbelief, and horror spread like wildfire, punctuated by the occasional squeal of someone realizing the gravity of the situation. I remained seated for a moment, letting the reality sink in, letting the storm pass through the room like a controlled demolition, leaving only the foundation intact. Adrian took my hand, his grip firm. "You were incredible," he whispered. I didn't even know what to do. You saved us both." I smiled softly, but my mind was already moving ahead. This wasn't over, not legally, not socially, not emotionally. Vivian's reach extended far beyond the reception hall, and her wealth, influence, and manipulative skill set meant she could make the next step difficult. But I had the evidence, the strategy, and the calm to see it through. We left the reception under the guise of a brief exit, ostensibly to give Vivian space in the hospital, but also to allow me a moment to strategize. In the car, Adrian's hand never left mine, his presence a grounding force. I relayed to him everything: the cameras, the pre-written note, the swap of glasses, the subtle behavioral cues I had tracked for weeks. "Your mother," I said, "she wasn't just trying to ruin the wedding. She was trying to destroy our lives. But she underestimated us. She underestimated the planning, the foresight, the ability to see every structural weakness, including hers." Adrian's face hardened, a mix of determination and fury. "She thought she could control me with guilt, with obligation, but we're done being collateral in her games." By the time we reached the hospital, the legal team I had contacted was already preparing. Officers were stationed outside the room, evidence cataloged and secured, ready for the inevitable investigation. I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm had hit, but the foundation held. Vivian was stabilized, her vitals slowly returning to normal, but the psychological and legal implications were just beginning. I watched her as she lay in the sterile room, her silver gown replaced with hospital attire, her composure shattered. Her face was a mask of disbelief and fury. She had lost control, and for someone like her, that was worse than any physical pain. Adrian stood beside me, silent, letting the officers do their work. Finally, he spoke. "This is the first time I've truly seen her for who she is." I nodded. "And now we build from here. No more fear, no more manipulation. We control our own story." The rest of the day passed in a blur of statements, evidence collection, and strategic planning. We ensured the narrative would be ours, untainted by Vivian's attempts to twist the truth. Every detail mattered: the footage, the note, the vial. Every step she had taken to manipulate the story became the proof of her intent. That night,
After the chaos had subsided, Adrian and I returned home. Exhausted but resolute, we sat in the quiet of our new apartment, a blank slate, far from the gilded cage Vivian had tried to construct around us. I poured a glass of water, letting the cool liquid soothe my nerves. "I never imagined a wedding could turn into that," Adrian said, shaking his head. I smiled faintly. It wasn't the wedding, it was the culmination of years of manipulation, and it taught us something invaluable. Our strength, our foresight, and our trust in each other are unbreakable. He reached out, brushing my hand, a silent promise that we would face everything together. And in that moment, amid the quiet and the soft glow of the city outside, I realized the truth. We weren't just surviving, we were beginning to thrive, stronger for the trials we had endured. The following days were a whirlwind of legal appointments, police interviews, and endless phone calls. The hotel had handed over all security footage, timestamps meticulously documented every move Vivian had made. Every whispered threat, every veiled insult, every act of premeditation was now evidence. Her network of high society allies scrambled to cover for her, but the documentation was irrefutable. Adrian and I sat across from our attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Clara Mendez, whose reputation for dismantling manipulative dynasties preceded her. She laid out the strategy: criminal charges for attempted poisoning, reckless endangerment, and premeditated assault, alongside a civil injunction to prevent Vivian from contacting us or interfering in our lives. "The evidence is overwhelming," Clara said, pointing to the video and the pre-written note. "She's left no room for plausible deniability. The moment we present this to the prosecutor, the case will move swiftly. The only question is how much drama she'll try to manufacture before it's over." I leaned back, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "We have to be careful," I said. "She thrives on chaos. She wants to rewrite this story, but we're not giving her that power anymore." Adrian reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "We don't have to," he said. "We control the narrative now." The next week was tense. News of the incident at the Sterling estate spread quietly at first, shielded from social media by a careful press release emphasizing Vivian's medical emergency. Our attorney ensured the focus stayed on her criminal actions, not rumors or gossip. For someone who had built her entire identity on public image and control, this was the first time Vivian felt powerless. When the arrest warrant was served, she resisted at first, claiming confusion and delirium, but the evidence was too concrete. The pre-written note, the security footage, eyewitness testimonies, it painted a picture of calculated malice. She was escorted from her lavish home in cuffs, her signature silver gown nowhere to be seen, replaced by the sterile monotony of a holding cell jumpsuit. Adrian and I attended the arraignment. Vivian's usual air of superiority had crumbled, replaced with a mask of defiance that could not hide fear. Her lawyer attempted to argue diminished capacity, claiming that stress had clouded her judgment, but the pre-written note, carefully dated and timestamped, obliterated that defense. One could not claim temporary insanity when one had already drafted a detailed plan of manipulation and assault days in advance. The judge, a stern woman with eyes that seemed to see through every pretense, reviewed the evidence. "Ms. Sterling," she said, her voice firm, "your actions endangered the life of another person. The court will see to it that justice is served." Vivian's shoulders slumped ever so slightly. For the first time, her control had a limit. Weeks later, the plea deal was finalized. 24 months for aggravated assault and reckless endangerment, no chance of early release due to the premeditated nature of the crime. The Sterling's vast network of influence could not rewrite this reality. It was final, concrete, undeniable. Adrian and I returned to our apartment that evening, the city lights spilling across the windows like a promise of new beginnings. For months, we had been living under the shadow of Vivian's schemes, and now that shadow was lifting. "I can't believe it's finally over," Adrian said, sitting beside me on the couch, his hand brushing mine. I smiled, leaning against him. "It's never truly over," I said softly, "but we've survived it. We've emerged stronger, more united than ever." We began the process of reclaiming our lives. The Sterling estate, which had loomed over our wedding with its history of intimidation, became irrelevant. Instead, we found a fixer-upper on the other side of the city. It was not perfect, but it had good bones. Every crack, every imperfection became a canvas for rebuilding, just as we had rebuilt ourselves. In the quiet of our new home, I revisited my craft, restoration. I sat at our kitchen table repairing a broken ceramic bowl using the Japanese art of kintsugi. Gold lacquer filled the cracks, highlighting the imperfections instead of hiding them. The philosophy was clear. What is broken can be transformed, can become stronger, can become beautiful. The analogy was not lost on me. Adrian watched silently, admiring both the bowl and the process. "It's beautiful," he said finally, "just like you." I smiled, dipping the brush into the gold powder. "Not perfect," I said, "but stronger than before." For the first time, we could plan our future without fear. No pretense, no manipulation, no toxic interference. Our wedding, which Vivian had tried to poison in every sense, became a symbol of resilience. Every challenge we had faced, the threats, the insults, the threats to our safety, had fused us together. The trauma didn't leave a scar, it left a seam of gold. We learned to trust each other on a level that most couples never achieve, because we had been tested by forces designed to tear us apart. I knew with absolute certainty that Adrian would choose me, not out of obligation, but out of mutual respect, love, and unwavering trust. And he knew that I would see the threats he might be blind to. Months later, as I placed the repaired bowl on the shelf, the golden cracks catching the afternoon sun, I felt a sense of closure. Imperfect, jagged, resilient. That was us. That was life. That was love. Our story became one not of fear or manipulation, but of triumph, a warning to those who seek to control others through wealth, status, or malice. The strongest structures are not always the ones that appear flawless. They are the ones that endure, adapt, and grow stronger under pressure. And as for Vivian, her reign of intimidation had ended. The system had caught up to her, but more importantly, we had survived. We had reclaimed our lives, our home, our trust, and our love. From that day forward, we rebuilt everything with intention, not for appearances, not for control, but for the kind of life that could withstand anything, because we were no longer fragile, we were unbreakable, and for the first time, I could smile at the golden seams in my hands and know that the beauty of life often comes from its most challenging fractures. The weeks after Vivian's sentencing were surreal. The court case had been publicized enough to serve as a cautionary tale, but private enough that our lives could slowly return to normal. Adrian and I moved into our new home, a mid-century fixer-upper that overlooked the river. It wasn't the grand Sterling estate, but it had character, history, and most importantly, privacy. The walls weren't perfect, the paint was faded in places, and the floors creaked in ways that made me smile. Everything about it spoke of life lived and life yet to be restored, just like us. I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor. Restoration wasn't just a profession, it was a philosophy. Every crack, every fracture, every imperfection had a story. I repaired walls, reinforced beams, and polished surfaces until the bones of the buildings gleamed like they were new. And in each project, I found lessons for life, patience, foresight, and respect for both fragility and strength. Adrian watched me one evening as I repaired an old window frame in our kitchen. The wood was rotted in places, but with careful sanding, epoxy, and polishing, it regained its elegance. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling. "You make everything look easy." I laughed, wiping sweat from my brow. "It's not easy, it just requires knowing where to hold on and where to let go." "Sounds like marriage," he said quietly. I looked at him, brushing sawdust from my hands. "Exactly like marriage," I replied. "Sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones that have survived stress and strain." Evenings became our sanctuary. We cooked together, repaired little things around the house, and spent hours just talking. The trauma from Vivian's schemes didn't disappear overnight, but we didn't let it fester. We talked about every anxiety, every fear, every lingering doubt. Trust was no longer assumed, it was intentional, nurtured, and unbreakable. One afternoon, I returned to the Sterling estate, not to work, but to retrieve some old documents Vivian had tried to destroy before her arrest. Walking through those halls, I felt no fear, no resentment, only a quiet satisfaction. The estate's grandeur, the intimidating art, the polished floors had all been tools of control in Vivian's hands. Now I walked as someone unafraid. The power she wielded was gone. I was in control of my life, my narrative, and my story. At home, we began a new tradition. Every Sunday, we'd restore something together. Sometimes it was furniture, sometimes ceramics, sometimes even old letters or photographs. Each repair became a metaphor for our marriage, broken, flawed, but capable of being strengthened and beautified with intention and care. One evening, as we were repairing an antique dresser, Adrian paused and held my hands in his. "Do you ever think about her?" I smiled faintly. "I think about her once or twice a week, then I let it go. She's no longer in our story, except as a cautionary footnote." Adrian nodded. "Good. I want us to remember the lessons, not the fear."
We didn't just rebuild objects, we rebuilt ourselves. We enrolled in couples therapy, not because our relationship was broken, but because we wanted to strengthen it. We learned to anticipate stress, communicate without defensiveness, and recognize patterns before they could escalate. It was proactive love, deliberate and enduring. Months passed. Seasons changed. Winter melted into spring, and the city outside our window bloomed in ways that reminded me of resilience. We invited friends over for quiet dinners. We laughed over small victories in our restoration projects. We allowed ourselves to celebrate life rather than obsess over past threats. And then came the day I decided to revisit the idea of kintsugi, not just as a craft, but as a life philosophy. I took a large ceramic bowl, broken beyond repair, and began to fill the cracks with gold lacquer. Each stroke was deliberate, meditative, and symbolic. With every gold line, I reminded myself that strength often comes from surviving pressure and fractures. Beauty is not in perfection, but in resilience. Adrian watched, quiet and reverent. "That's us," he said finally. I nodded. "Every scar is a seam of gold," I whispered. The final lesson Vivian unintentionally taught us was one of foresight and vigilance. We established security measures around our home, a small but essential network of cameras and alerts, not because we feared her, but because we recognized that life's fractures often appear where least expected. Being prepared was not paranoia, it was wisdom. Our social circle shifted too. Friends who had stood by us during the wedding chaos became our chosen family. Distance was put between us and the toxic remnants of the Sterling network. Vivian's allies tried to maintain influence, but without her commanding presence, their power dwindled. Eventually, it faded entirely, leaving us to live unencumbered. One quiet evening, Adrian and I sat on the balcony, watching the sun sink into the horizon. The city glittered below like fragments of gold, echoing the philosophy we had embraced. What was broken could shine brighter than before. "I never thought we'd get here," Adrian said softly. I rested my head on his shoulder. "Neither did I, but we did. And we'll keep getting here, every day." That night, I reflected on the journey. The wedding, the vial, Vivian's schemes, the hospital, the trial, it all seemed like another lifetime. And yet every step had been a lesson in resilience, trust, and love. Our marriage was no longer about avoiding harm, it was about thriving despite it. Adrian squeezed my hand. "To the unbreakable us," he whispered. I smiled, tracing the golden seams of the repaired bowl beside us. "To the unbreakable us," I echoed. And in that moment, the fractures of our past glimmered with purpose, transformed into something stronger, something lasting, something beautiful. We had survived the storm. We had outlasted the architect of chaos,
and together we built a life where the cracks didn't hide weakness, they revealed strength. Even as we settled into our new home, the echoes of the wedding day occasionally whispered through our lives, not as fear, but as a reminder of vigilance and perspective. Some nights I would wake, heart pounding for no reason other than habit, only to find Adrian's steady hand on my shoulder. His presence was proof that survival wasn't just about avoiding danger, it was about thriving with someone who had your back when the world tried to break you. Yet the past had a way of sneaking in. One rainy afternoon, I was in the study, cataloging old restoration projects for my portfolio, when a memory surfaced. The first time I had seen Vivian, before I even knew her name, had been during the preliminary inspection of the Sterling estate. I had been wearing work boots dusted in plaster, carrying a clipboard brimming with notes. She had appeared out of nowhere, her heels clicking like a metronome of judgment. I remembered the way she had tilted her head, examined my hands as though they carried contagion, and asked Adrian if he was hiring the staff to clean up after me. Back then, I had brushed it off, chalking it up to the arrogance of old money, but now I saw the pattern. Every slight, every calculated insult, every orchestrated slight, small fissures that were meant to undermine confidence, to destabilize. She had spent years laying the groundwork, a silent, structural sabotage designed to break me before I ever became part of their world. Adrian appeared behind me, watching my expression change as I reviewed old inspection photos. "Thinking about her?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Not just her, the way she planned everything, the meticulousness. She didn't just want control, she wanted to rewrite reality. Every conversation, every gesture, every dinner was a calculated stress test. He frowned. And she failed. I smiled faintly. Yes, but it wasn't just her failure, it was our learning curve. Every challenge we endured, every manipulation we detected, made us stronger. We had learned to recognize the subtle signs of toxicity, to map them as precisely as one might map a compromised beam in a crumbling building. Vivian had been trying to collapse the structure of our lives from the inside out, and we had survived because we understood architecture, not just of buildings, but of human dynamics. The next week, we tackled our first large joint restoration project since the wedding. A historic theater on the edge of the city had been abandoned for decades. Its once grand chandelier was tarnished, the floors warped, and the seating torn. But beneath the decay, there was potential, a structure yearning to shine again. As we worked side by side, Adrian on structural reinforcements, I on aesthetic and historical preservation, I realized how much our shared trauma had transformed into synergy. We didn't just coordinate tasks, we anticipated each other's thoughts, communicated without words, and covered weaknesses the other might overlook. It was a dance of trust, precision, and intuition. One evening, after a long day of sanding, polishing, and reinforcing, we paused at the top balcony of the theater, looking down at the rows of seats. Dust motes swirled in the sunset, streaming through broken windows, turning them into golden fireflies. Adrian leaned close. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think love was about protection. Now I know it's about resilience." I laughed quietly. "Resilience and gold seams." He raised an eyebrow. "Gold seams?" "Kintsugi," I explained. "It's a Japanese technique. You repair broken ceramics with lacquer and gold powder. The cracks don't disappear, they become the most beautiful part of the piece. That's us. That's our life." He smiled, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and awe. "Then let's make everything we touch shine, even the cracks." That night, we worked late, restoring a damaged proscenium arch. As I delicately applied the gold-infused lacquer to a carved detail, I thought about Vivian, about the precision of her cruelty, about how she had tried to break us at the most vulnerable moment of our lives. But her intent had only illuminated our resilience, our ability to thrive under pressure, and our unbreakable bond. Weeks turned into months. The theater reopened, its grand interior restored to a brilliance it hadn't seen in decades. And like the theater, we had reopened ourselves to the world, not naive, but healed, stronger, and fully aware of the fragility and strength in every human connection. Social gatherings became a deliberate exercise in setting boundaries.
Former Sterling associates tried to infiltrate our lives subtly, dropping hints and attempting to influence Adrian through guilt or nostalgia. Each time, we handled it together, a silent code of trust and alignment guiding every interaction. No longer were we reactive, we were proactive, fortified by the lessons of the past. The final confrontation with Vivian came not in a courtroom, but in our shared reflection of resilience. A letter arrived, penned from her prison cell. She claimed remorse, but it lacked sincerity, a poorly veiled attempt at manipulation even behind bars. Adrian and I read it together, and instead of anger, we felt affirmation. Her manipulations no longer held power. She was irrelevant to the architecture of our lives. As winter gave way to spring, we hosted a small celebration in the restored theater. Friends and family gathered, not to witness our victory over Vivian, but to honor the resilience, trust, and love that had brought us through the storm. I looked across the room at Adrian, and he smiled at me, understanding without words that our story wasn't about revenge, but about restoration. Later, as we walked hand in hand along the river near our home, I realized that every fracture, every toxic encounter, every stress test had become a golden seam. We had been tested, challenged, and even threatened, but in surviving, we had transformed the cracks into beauty. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in its reality, we had found something stronger than perfection: unbreakable trust, deliberate love, and the kind of resilience that glimmers like gold in the sunlight. And in that moment, I knew we weren't just survivors of one toxic matriarch's plan. We were architects of our own destiny, engineers of a love that could withstand anything, and artisans of a life that had been broken and made beautiful again. Spring settled fully over the city, brushing the streets with cherry blossoms and sunlight that felt almost deliberate in its warmth. Adrian and I had developed a rhythm to our lives that we both cherished. The theater restoration was complete, our home slowly transforming into a reflection of us, not anyone else's expectations. But the real restoration wasn't of buildings, it was of hearts, trust, and the architecture of our lives together. Some days I would still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting Vivian's shadow to loom. It was instinct, the remnants of years navigating a minefield of manipulation. But the instinct was no longer fear, it was awareness. I had learned to see cracks before they formed, to detect structural weaknesses in people, in relationships, and in situations, just as I had learned to see weaknesses in old foundations or delicate woodwork. Adrian had grown in ways I hadn't expected. The quiet confidence I first noticed in him during the wedding had blossomed into a deep, intuitive understanding of not just people, but of life's precarious balances. He was the calm in the storm, but more importantly, he was the anchor for my own resilience. Together, we had become a team that could anticipate stress points, repair damage, and reinforce trust. One afternoon, while we were going over plans for our next restoration project, a century-old library with ornate windows and creaking floors, I felt a strange sense of peace. The chaos of the past year seemed almost surreal now, a vivid memory that had shaped us but no longer defined us. I looked at Adrian, who was bent over the architectural drawings, pencil in hand. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't handled everything the way we did?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes steady and unwavering. "All the time. And every time the answer is the same. We would have survived, but not like this. Not with the strength we have now, and certainly not with the trust we share. Every challenge, every moment of doubt, it all became our gold seam." The metaphor of kintsugi, the art of repairing broken ceramics with gold, had become our mantra. Our lives were not perfect, but the cracks, the fractures, the traumas, they were gilded now. They were proof of survival, proof of resilience, and proof of love that could endure the most calculated cruelty. Later that evening, we hosted a small gathering at the theater, a celebration of life, trust, and resilience. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered, unaware of the storm we had weathered, but all bearing witness to the harmony we had built. We shared stories, laughed over old mishaps, and marveled at the beauty of a restored space. And for the first time in a long while, I felt completely untethered from Vivian's shadow.
Adrian raised his glass to me, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers we had painstakingly polished. "To us," he said, voice rich with emotion, "to the gold seams of life and to building something stronger than any challenge that comes our way." I clinked my glass against his, feeling the warmth of the moment spread through me. "To us," I echoed. Months passed, and the Sterling estate faded into memory. Court proceedings had cemented Vivian's fate. She remained in prison, her manipulations powerless from behind bars. The pre-written note she had crafted to control the narrative became a central piece of evidence, ensuring that justice was served without compromise. Adrian and I no longer carried the weight of anticipation or fear. We carried something far more valuable: confidence in each other and in the life we were creating together. Our home became a haven, each room a testament to patience, repair, and intentional beauty. I spent mornings restoring antique ceramics, applying gold-infused lacquer to the cracks with precision and reverence. Adrian, meanwhile, meticulously worked on structural plans for our next projects, his mind sharp and unrelenting. Together, we balanced artistry and engineering, intuition and logic, emotion and pragmatism. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adrian and I sat on our balcony, overlooking the city that had once seemed so imposing. I held a small bowl I had repaired that morning, the gold seams catching the last rays of sunlight. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "It's more than that," I replied. "It's proof. Proof that what's broken can be stronger than it ever was before, that fragility can become resilience, that trauma can become beauty." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "And so are we." We spent the night talking about the future, about the family we wanted, and the legacy of love and trust we would build. No one would ever control or manipulate us again, and if challenges came, we knew exactly how to face them, together, with eyes wide open and hearts unshakable. The story of Vivian was no longer one of fear. It was a story of triumph, of strategy, of love that refused to bend under pressure. Our wedding, once marred by a calculated attempt at disaster, had become the foundation of a life intentionally restored. Every betrayal, every stress test, every attempt to undermine us had been transformed into gold. As I finished repairing another delicate ceramic piece, I thought of the lessons we had learned. That love was not about perfection, it was about restoration. That trust was not given blindly, it was earned and reinforced every day. That resilience was not simply enduring, it was transforming adversity into beauty, into strength, into gold seams. And as Adrian came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, I knew then that the gold seams of life were not just in the bowls, the buildings, or the artifacts we restored. They were in us, imperfect, jagged, and unbreakable. And that was the ultimate restoration.